Hello and welcome to another video. I am sat here in this wonderful 14th century church with my good friend Ryan.
Hello.
This time we're talking about Advent and Christmas. We're going to take a deep dive into the themes of Advent, the kind of light and darkness. We're going to look into some of the folklore around Christmas, from Santa Claus or Saint Nick to some of the kind of darker areas that are kind of emerging in our culture now. So we're going to chat about the Krampus figure, and ultimately we want to look at what all of this means for us today. So Ryan, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, great to be here.
In our recent Mead and Meaning discussion that we have, we meet once a month. It's kind of open to anyone to join us. We talked about light and dark.
Yeah.
And that kind of duality.
Yeah, and I think the Advent image actually and the Advent icon actually came up in the discussion we had in, the other week, and sort of gave us a few ideas for today really. But I think it's such an essential part of the image of Advent and image of Christmas. The nativity scene is very heavily based on this image of light and dark, and this idea of this little seed or little bit of light hidden away in the darkest place.
Yep.
And obviously that's reflected in the sky with the star in the dark night sky as well.
Yeah, and like the image in the nativity icon as well, as of Christ in a cave, like the manger, the stable, kind of in that region potentially being a cave back then where the animals are, and he's coming into the lowest place.
There's also this like kind of foreshadowing of this image of the resurrection and him coming out of the tomb.
Yeah, and I think, again, that's the kind of beauty of the narrative of like the Gospels, in the way that they thematically speak, like the beginning speaks to the end, like in a way that before you're actually paying any attention to these stories, before you're paying any attention to Scripture, maybe before you're a Christian, you're just like, I don't know, that's invisible to you. But realizing, even like how the Magi bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh, how myrrh is used to kind of anoint the body of someone who's died. That's actually a foreshadowing of the fact that he is actually born to die for the world, for the sins of the world. Like this baby, like it's so rich. There's just like so much in it. There's so many levels on which it all works and it speaks to itself, that I just kind of find is endlessly giving. And again, that's why the church is so smart in the way that it structures things on a repeating kind of liturgical cycle. It's as if like the fathers, and they understood how Scripture kind of reveals more and more to us year upon year, like as we walk with Christ, as we grow.
It's interesting because there's like it's obviously the cyclical nature of the liturgical year, and the calendar is obviously mapped onto the actual cyclical nature of the year, of the physical year.
Like the seasons.
The seasons and everything like that. And so having that kind of, it's almost like the story just goes around, but like I said, each time it's different and there's something more revealing about it. And I noticed that at Easter.
Yeah.
And then at the following Christmas, going to like the carol services. These are things that I'd known existed forever, and I've been to carol services in the past, just as like with my school and things like that. But these really hit, like I really felt them, and I was like, this is something different. I didn't know this was a thing.
Yeah.
And I noticed that around Easter at church, that the time of year just felt different, and that then reflected out into my life a little bit.
And you see it when you leave the church, then like leave the church building after the service, you see it around you, like whether it's the darkness here at Christmas time, or whether it's like life coming back, you know, on Easter Sunday.
We recently did one of our Mead and Meaning meetings where we got together online and had a few people talk about, look at the difference between like light and dark, and kind of the image of the light in the dark. And as we was discussing that, the image of Advent actually came up as like an image of that kind of duality of the light and dark, and how that it's ultimately, that is then what Advent is all about. It's this darkest time of year and the light emerging from the darkness. That's really what we're doing now. Advent's the process, obviously, of waiting for that. And we're now waiting for the coming of the Lord, basically, the coming of the light in the dark.
Yeah, there's a really interesting element to it, which was completely invisible to me before I was a Christian, where you obviously have a kind of liturgical remembering of Christ's arrival, of the incarnation happening in history. You know, Christ being born, to the Virgin Mary. But then there's also there's a sense that we're remembering that's happened, but then we're also kind of waiting for that to happen again. So we're kind of waiting for Christ's return, for the end of history. And actually, there's a kind of a third sense of actually Christ being born spiritually within us.
Yes.
Which is really interesting. There's these multiple layers.
Yeah, I recently saw, I think it might have been Bishop Barron, but he said something like that Advent is for those who've fallen away from Christ. He said Advent is your time, meaning like this is where you're this dark place and you're now waiting. But when Christ comes, there's this sense of like this internal Christ coming and being born in me, essentially. Yeah. There's something fascinating to me about the image of the light and the dark. Obviously, it's used in the book of John, at the start of the book of John, to really sort of lay out this sort of contrast between the light and the dark, and how Christ is the light that sort of comes into the world. And
I used to kind of think it was kind of just a little bit arbitrary, like oh yeah, Jesus is born, and because we get that kind of cultural Christianity, which has a place, right, of like being kids at school, like in England. When we were growing up in the 90s, like even non-church schools would probably have like a nativity play. And so, they kind of tell the story of, Mary and Joseph traveling on the donkey and all that kind of stuff. But I kind of just used to think it was kind of arbitrary. But then when you get deeper into this and you look at all the different levels of how it can apply to your own life, like I think of Christ being born, so like you say, the light coming into the lowest place, like possible, like a stable, a cave, like the middle of nowhere, wandering wilderness, like around with the animals.
Kind of hidden as well.
Kind of hidden. But then how that translates in a spiritual sense to our own lives, like to me, like to the manger that is my life. The messy manger that is my life, and Christ coming into that constantly, all the time. But how that's quite like how I'm speaking in a way, for some people, maybe not yourselves if you're already watching YouTube videos like this, but for a lot of people that could seem, whoa, that's quite abstract. And it can get very abstract, and you can almost spiritualize it away. People talk about the cosmic Christ, like a universal Christ. But the beauty of what the church does is it goes, it's got this event. It's got this event, this kind of historical incarnation, and we pin it to that. So we pin it to Christ coming, in the year zero, or however you date it, right? Maybe it's 1 or 2 years later, whatever. That it happens. This idea that, I think it was Bishop Barron as well, who said logos is not mythos. It's like an actual incarnation happens. But then from that, there's kind of multiple levels of interpretation.
Yes.
Which are so rich when you actually, take the step of kind of faith. Like it makes it all so rich, like.
We know that the image of like the light coming from the lowest place is right, because there's this idea of someone hitting rock bottom, and everyone knows of these stories where people's lives fall apart, and it's not until they reach this this really hellish, really low down, the lowest they've ever been, the darkest their lives have ever been, that there's a chance for like renewal almost. It's like sometimes everything has to burn off and then everything else has to go, and you almost have to be reduced down to like this single point. And that's where the divine spark or the flame or the light can emerge. And I was thinking of it, you hear it all the time with people who sometimes have religious conversions and become Christians after an experience like going into the darkest place. And I think this nativity scene, it's a weird way to sort of connect it, because you never think of the birth of baby Jesus being this associated with like all this terrible, people's lives falling apart and things, but it really is this like lowest, darkest place, and then suddenly out of that has the potential, because I think the light and the light's associated, I think, with the seed as well. I think that's almost the same image. Obviously, they're different characteristics, but I think they're like parallel images, because there's just potential, and once things get whittled down to nothing but their potential, that's when great growth can happen. And if once the light kind of enters into that dark place, you then have this potential for huge growth and huge sort of like transformation, I suppose.
There's something interesting, again, kind of speaking into a kind of, secular society that we're in most all Western countries, where you hear people kind of talking about Christmas. In a way, we're talking about patterns which have some universality to them, like they're found like light and dark, found in different cultures and things. And people say, Christmas is a pagan festival, and it was kind of taken by the church, and made into like a Christian thing. Like it celebrates the solstice, and the Christmas tree is pagan. I just wondered if you, last time when we did the Halloween video, you kind of gave us a run through.
I've been thinking about this quite a lot, obviously, and I think to start with, I was a bit sort of like, how am I going to approach this? But then I had a bit of a revelation, which this is going to sound a bit silly, but people argue that the idea of like the Christmas festival predates Christianity, but the Christmas festival actually and the Christmas celebration is a celebration of the birth of Christ. And so that cannot predate Christianity. That is what we mean when we say Christmas. And I think what people mean when they say Christmas is a pagan holiday, they are saying holy day as well, which adds another layer of confusion to it. But when people say it's a pagan holiday, I think what they're actually talking about is some of the traditions that exist within Christmas predate the celebration of strictly Christians. And I think there's definitely something to that. But in the same way, Christianity is really known for what it does is it goes into a place and it takes the traditions and culture and it transforms it in a way that fits this pattern of Christ. And then it almost through all things kind of then point back to Christ. And what I find really interesting about it is you hear that in like TikTok videos or whatever of people or little YouTube videos where people are saying Christians are a pagan holiday and all these traditions are pagan in origin, but Christianity is the religion that transforms. That's why imagine someone making the same argument about the cross, being like that cross was pagan. It's like, that's the point. Like
it's a really good point.
Christ took a pagan torture device, like one of the most brutal torture devices you can imagine, and made it the symbol of Christianity. Like that is a transformation
symbol
of pagan.
Of hope again. Like
so he took
the light turning something into something dark, so horrible.
So that is the symbol of Christianity itself is like the actual symbol of it is literally a transformed pagan.
And I want to just point out as well, I'm completely with you. The actual date, the 25th of December as Christ's birthday, I didn't know this until relatively recently. I don't know why I hadn't kind of connected the dots, but it follows 9 months, so the length of a pregnancy, from the Feast of the Annunciation. So 9 months before, the church calculated, right, okay, this is which is around the time of Easter, as it were, as it happens. This is the time where we mark the angel Gabriel coming and telling the Blessed Virgin Mary that she's going to bear a child. 9 months after that date, it's Christmas. So there is even a kind of, it doesn't even really bother me like that there are parallels with marking things at the darkest time of the year, at least for like the Northern Hemisphere. It doesn't even bother me. But there is actually a debate there to be had that says actually the 25th of December, it's probably not even like that's a separate development. But like you say, there's and we talked about this last time with Halloween, there's an element of incorporating pagan elements. One of the most obvious ones is the tree. Like the way that the tree is used, it doesn't seem to have much of an origin in like Judaism and the early Christian thing about using a tree. It's very much a Northern European thing. I've heard one Christian say, really good YouTube channel that I follow, and he said actually it's the wrong tree. It would be an oak tree would be pagan, and a pine tree wouldn't be. But again, I think that's a technicality. I think there clearly is something sacred in the tree. Actually, even in Genesis, there is the tree of life. So,
of course,
the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So there are trees.
And I think the reason why we don't use oak trees, one, because most of them are way too large to have in a house, but it's the triangular shape to a pine tree, which I think better represents what it's trying to show, because we put a star or an angel on top of the tree. It's almost like the Principality, which gathers everything together. It's this like a hierarchy, basically.
The star just wouldn't stand out as much if it wasn't kind of like a mountain or like a point to say like, look at the highest point, look, there it is. Like,
it wouldn't the whole Christmas tree is like is gathered together into that single point, and I think that's why the star is usually the main ornament on a Christmas tree. Everything else will be smaller than the star or the angel or whatever you have on the top. But it has to have this, like, it's got an order to it.
But like these elements, like we're here in this church, there's some holly. You know, I've got a holly wreath on my door. Like the use of things that appear in kind of Western Europe and incorporating them. It's just a kind of a beautiful thing to do. Like it draws you in. Like it's in a way the greenery of these kind of evergreen plants acts as a kind of light as well. Yeah, everything's dead, and so you're bringing in like pines which are still alive, and you're bringing in things to add light or add color or add life. I mean, you can see light as life, the same thing, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, in John's prologue it says the light was the life of men. So I don't know. There's so much kind of typology happening here. Yeah. It just kind of really kind of sings when you bring it all together. Yeah. And I think, you know, certainly with something we're interested in doing with Disciples of the Divine Logos is looking at all these elements that we hadn't noticed before in our culture. We can kind of quickly, I always say this, but we can kind of doom spiral a little bit for those of us who have found Christ, be like, it's like, I feel like I'm moving so far away from everything. But actually our culture is so deeply informed by, obviously Christianity, the church, all these traditions can kind of illuminate a way back.
Yeah, you're right though. There is so many like little tiny details in what I think Christianity is really good at is taking the cultures of these local areas and looking at them and seeing what can fit into this story. And like you said, there's the evergreen nature, this like constantly renewing life that doesn't die.
It's got kind of resurrection in it, and all the same kind of themes.
Yeah, it's got like eternal life, all these kind of things going on in it. Yeah, and there's something really cool about that. I found something interesting about the Christmas tree, which I was. The presents are kind of, they go at the bottom of the tree and they kind of go in this dark place underneath the tree. And it's a little bit like the nativity scene, there's this like concealed thing, potentially treasure, potentially something bad in this kind of present or coal sort of idea that you're not really sure what it is until you open it up. But you know that there's something hidden away. And while it's hidden, its potential, again, it's this like, in a weird way, it's almost the fruits of the tree is this idea of this present being underneath this tree. So you have this principality at the top of the star, and then as you kind of move down, it ends up producing something in the dark, and it's basically the image of it's like a nativity icon that you'd have the star, and then directly below you'd have Christ at the bottom, and Christ is this gift that's kind of concealed within his mother and within the manger or the cave.
And of course, at this time of year, one of the huge elements we kind of hear in churches, in the scripture that's read, are the parts of the gospel that pertain to Our Lady, to the Blessed Virgin Mary. I feel like Mary is, who was it now? It was an American Roman Catholic evangelist, and he said he drew this parallel between like forgetting about the Virgin Mary and like losing Christ. He was like, when the world lost the Blessed Mother, it lost the Son. And he was kind of speaking into the kind of excesses of the Reformation that just removed, I'll put the name on the screen, a really prominent American evangelist. And I think there's a lot to that. But Advent is a time where actually we do think about the Virgin Mary, we do think about the role that she plays in kind of bringing and kind of saying yes to God, and really kind of, for want of a better word, kickstarting like the whole thing, basically. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I think the image of the Virgin Mary, which I think is probably one of the most sacred images we have. And the reason I say this is, as on a cultural level, I think that the image of the mother and baby is incredibly sacred.
And I think there really is something to do, and this is what this American evangelist I think is. He's pointing to it in terms of like losing the Christian faith, but I also think there's something about just losing truth as well, like reflected on from that is like losing the true way to live. Like we see it in like, let's be honest, like declining birth rates and a pretty low view of children that we take in the West today.
Yeah.
I do think there's something about losing the image of, you say the mother and the child, like losing the Blessed Virgin Mary and Christ, like losing that image, the Christ child and the mother.
Yeah.
That we're seeing something like the mother is becoming like invisible. Like not only do mothers kind of have children and then probably like the pressures of work, they have to go back to work pretty quickly. All of that in modern society, but like we're literally losing like people not having children. And
part of the problem, I think, is probably something else about Mary, which you don't really get sometimes in just this image of the mother and child, is you have the ultimate in like the virtuous mother.
Yeah.
And obviously the virgin birth is something associated with Christ only, and it's not like a woman can set that as a standard to be another virgin mother, obviously, but there's something about she's almost the anti-Eve in a way, like this opposite of Eve.
Yeah.
And because of that, it's such an important image, I think, to have us hold up and to recognize that without...
She literally says, all generations will call me blessed.
Yeah.
Like...
And we do.
We do.
Yeah.
But for actually too few Christians, I would argue.
Yes, yeah.
Especially in our like culture.
I think you're right.
I mean, literally, they only probably think about her at Christmas.
She's become a character in the Nativity.
Yeah.
That's what she... I'm just thinking about how I thought of her before I became Christian.
But you can see that she is a kind of... she is the door in which the incarnation comes. Yeah. Like in every sense, but also talking about this kind of spiritual level of reading reading scripture and everything, and the spiritual level, like you could see that if you don't, it's like she's the place where the incarnation happens.
Yeah.
So it's like, unless we rediscover her and that image of the saint, she's not God, she's not Christ, she's like the kind of highest image of the saint.
And I think you're right. There's a tendency to, especially among the more Protestant sides of the church, to kind of that have difficulty even with saints, that they don't really recognise them or would rather not. And I think because of Mary being like this ultimate representation of a saint, there's a tendency to just almost for her to obscure the image of Christ. And it seems like there's a tendency to move her out of the way to just be, and I know especially the more Protestant a church seems to get, or the message gets, it's more just you and Christ, this like direct relationship, and anything that gets in the way is almost like an obstacle, becomes an obstacle or something that obscures your direct relationship. And I think, I mean, I don't know if you want to it's a rabbit hole we go down.
But it does feel a little bit like, she's part of the, again, on this kind of spiritual reading, she is part of the journey towards Christ. And so, the logic follows that losing her, you lose a place for, like I say, you lose the place for the incarnation to enter.
Yeah. Yeah, even in terms of like from a narrative sense,
that's what I mean.
She is essential.
Yeah,
you actually can't have.
Yeah, but then you get the kind of worst, the kind of criticism of a kind of extreme form of Platonism that just spiritualizes away Christianity. Like it's all, you see this kind of, it's all just about kind of going to heaven, going to heaven. But Mary's where the materiality of it matters. Like some of the prayers that you read, the medieval prayers, and I've been reading some on my own kind of prayer life lately, the medieval prayers you read about Mary, some of them are a little bit shocking because, they speak about like the body in a way, like they're shocking to our modern sensibilities, but for medievals, the materiality, the fact that she was a mother, really mattered. Yeah. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that when we lose the Blessed Mother, we lose an element of the material reality of the Christian faith. Yeah. Like that the incarnation happens. It's not like a ghostly Christ walks down to earth and teaches us all these nice things, then disappears. It's like, no, it really happens in space and time.
Yeah, and it goes through a route that literally every person that has ever been born has gone through. It's gone through this same process. It's gone through the process of conception to all the way through. And I think the fact that, it's interesting because Christ doesn't start as a fully formed baby or as a young man or as an adult. He starts as essentially where everyone else starts. He starts right at
like an embryo.
As an embryo,
Yeah.
And there's something interesting to that.
Yeah. Of course, then, sorry, I'm going to be the geek here. In material reality, he starts as that, but then, like, obviously, in part of the Trinity, like, he exists before all things.
Yeah, of course.
But I know what you're saying.
His material life,
Yeah.
or his incarnation.
Comments of being heretics in the comment section. But there's I've lately discovered, and I feel like that was a really convoluted way for me to sort of try and explain where I feel the significance of Mary is. And, these discussions, like, I feel like we're learning as we discuss stuff, and that's kind of what it's all about. But I've lately been really diving deeper into the significance of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And once you do that, like you mentioned about going caroling and going to church at Christmas time, like, you notice so many kind of beautiful lyrics and poetry, basically, like honouring her. And you can see the significant role that she played in Christianity. It still plays, but like, especially for us as English Christians, like how significant she is. And I don't know, I find it really quite beautiful as well, speaking of someone with a young family and thinking about my own wife as a mother, and my wife really honours the Virgin Mary, and it's just quite a rich thing to discover. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and she of course has her own form of sacrifice later down the line, which again is something that I think all mothers can relate to and can partake in.
Yeah, I mean, we speak in a way often in these videos, I certainly do, where I'm like, Christianity does this, Christianity does that, but it's kind of, it's not a top-down thing. The gift giving obviously is in the narrative.
Yes.
Like, so you just opened up a kind of symbolic meaning, but like the gift giving, obviously the wise men, the magi bring gifts.
Yeah.
Like everything has its kind of root in something concrete. And then, like you said, Christ is a gift to the world, but then like we bring gifts. And I don't know, I think
it ties us back into that like logos idea, the idea that there's this event that happened, and then it's interesting because I know Jordan Peterson talks about, he's got the famous video where he talks about where he's talking to Pageau, and he talks about the narrative world and the material world and the symbolic world touching, I think is the two worlds.
In Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, but he says that sometimes the symbolic world and the material world literally touch, and that happens in Jesus obviously all the time. And his story is a lot of like, it's these things that they are universal patterns, but they also manifest themselves around him. Yeah. Which in theory I suppose they should do, as he's the logo. So it's got, like around Christmas, all these patterns that surround Christmas seem to be the same image repeating themselves, which is this like light in the dark place. It's this like hidden small thing, and then this hope and this potential, and all those themes seem to like surround it. And I just find that quite interesting, even all the way up to like the idea of like Rudolph with his nose is
lighting the darkness.
Yeah, lighting the darkness. Lighting the way for Santa, so that like it's just it's weird how all these things just have this same image just repeating themselves, and obviously we associate Christmas with lights because we have Christmas lights. Yeah. Like that phrase, everyone knows what that means. It's like we put lights up at Christmas because, like, I don't know why, why we do that. Yeah. But I think it's because it makes sense.
I kind of wish, I mean, we're making this video for a reason, because we want to talk about these things. There's obviously loads of other stuff on YouTube talking about it as well. But I almost wish there was a way to communicate the breadth of all of this. Like, you think of the worst excesses of Christmas are like, shopping centres, like busy, consumerism, like maybe some really tacky lights, like sometimes terrible music, like that's all the kind of worst. And you just they're the kind of worst excesses of the holiday, especially in its kind of secularized form. But even within that, there are these little, just like lights, and even we're going to get on to Father Christmas or Santa Claus in a minute, but like even that, there's like a way you kind of wish if only you could help people to see that these things can offer you a way back in to like this deeper, richer world. I made a little video last year about St. Nicholas, and there's some tension within Christianity, for Christians, there's a tension with whether you kind of celebrate, you kind of do St. Nicholas if you've got children or not, do Father Christmas, sorry. But I made this video last year where I was just kind of thinking, actually, it's kind of like a seed of the Logos. Like Justin Martyr was the first, one of the first Christian apologists. Like he was in the kind of Greco-Roman world, kind of making the case for Christianity. Obviously, he was martyred, hence his name. Yeah. But he looked at like the pagan philosophers, and he said actually they've got seeds of like the Logos, like seeds of something that can lead to Christ.
Yeah.
And then from there you get like St. Augustine and all these guys who are using who are interested in pagan philosophy because they can see where it can be kind of useful.
Yeah.
Anyway, all of that to say, and it's kind of a bit of a hammy comparison, but you kind of have that within like Santa Claus in the way that he can lead to St. Nicholas, the kind of main legend of St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas of Myra, historically, he's this bishop who lives in Turkey in around, I think it's the 4th century. And the story goes that St. Nicholas hears of a man who can't afford to provide his 3 daughters, their children, they're maybe teenagers, can't afford to provide them with dowries. So a sum of money that they would need in order to marry a man, and if they don't have that, in the context in which they were living, the idea would be that you couldn't get married. No one would marry you without a dowry. So in all likelihood, as the story goes, they would be sold into prostitution or maybe even slavery. So Nicholas hears of this, and one night he sneaks out with 3 bags of gold for the dowries. He sneaks up to the house and he throws the bags through an open window. And so you can see this kind of parallels there with the Santa Claus story of like something entering into the house through an unconventional way, whether it's down the chimney or through a window. Like the important point is it's not through the door. So there's a lot going on there. There's the idea of it preserving innocence.
Yeah.
Like because they have this, okay, it's not a toy, but because they have like Santa Claus, but they have this money, and in a way they can live a good life. They're not kind of sold into this kind of darkness. So again, it mirrors the way that Christ, brings salvation, brings hope. In a way, St. Nicholas and even the consumerism has something good in it, just deep down, maybe it's buried, but the idea that now in this world that really tempts kids, the way that our culture kind of encourages kids to not be kids, it like tries to, makes them into adults before they're ready, like when they should still be living in a state of innocence, that Santa Claus brings them a toy, something that says, through the parents, right? Here's a toy, you're still a child.
Yeah.
Like there's a parallel there with the girls and preserving them from a life of prostitution. So there's loads there.
You can really see the spirit of the modern day Santa Claus in that story and how it sort of snowballed into what it's become today. And I think what I think we're at risk at, as you've already mentioned, the idea of consumerism, and that does worry me a little bit. I'm quite concerned about that the idea of the magic of Christmas is actually, for a lot of people, especially for people who don't really see the religious context, obviously it's there, but they might not see it. The people who don't see Christmas as a religious holiday, I think this secular Christmas, is the magic of Christmas might actually be something like an ecstatic consumerism, basically. That it's just this like being use it like serotonin, like using this dopamine into a sort of blissful state.
I think that is the argument that it like some Christians, really don't go in for Santa Claus at all. I think that is the argument that all the trappings of the secular Christmas just completely obscure the fact that it celebrates Christ's birthday.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful because you have to be very careful of that. I think but it's the Saint Nick connection. I think where the Santa can glorify Christ ultimately. Yeah. In a roundabout way, but like you said, the temptation and risk of it is that you may just focus on the parts of the Santa and parts of the modern Christmas which don't really have as much to do with Christ. But a lot of these things are actually a lot more modern than I originally realized, and I think it was the 19th century where most of these things came from. and usually just from a poem or
a night
two.
before, I think it was a night before Christmas.
Yeah,
which was, if I'm right, someone can correct me, but I think it was written by an Anglican or Episcopalian priest over in the US. Like the images of, so like attaching reindeers and like that he's a kind of jolly old, well, I mean, the St. Nicholas is an old guy in icons and images, but the idea that he's kind of a bit jolly and a bit plump. Yeah. Pretty sure it comes from that part.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see that it's not actually that old of a tradition, the modern, more modern sort of imagery that you see around Christmas, and the sort of, let's say the style of Christmas is actually not super old, but I think we have to be, just because something's not super old doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. And I think that as things develop, we sometimes get new traditions or newer traditions.
It doesn't mean, which I think is probably what we're both saying, it doesn't mean that it can't point you back to something good.
Yes.
Like, to use the example of Justin Martyr, he sees these seeds of the Logos in kind of pagan philosophy rather than Santa Claus. But the analogy holds that is there something that he was kind of saying that they were pointing forward to Christ.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm kind of saying, and I know it's a bit hammy to use Santa Claus where he was talking about Aristotle and Plato, but like, I'm just thinking of the Santa with the Coca-Cola, and I'm like, it's pointing back to Christ, pointing back to Christ. But I am kind of making that claim that Christ can fill all these things up, he can redeem all of these things. How that happens is more of a mystery. Again, we kind of talk about Christianity does this very well, but we know actually it's people, it's Christians that do it. And I think from my perspective, it's up to individuals whether they, celebrate Santa Claus. Like if you've got children, I mean, we do it in our house, but in a kind of hopefully a fairly measured way. It's up to the individual to do that. But I think the more people that are willing to talk about St. Nicholas and the St. Nicholas connection, the better. Like, I think the worst thing to do is for Christians to be like, kind of just derogatory towards the culture and towards Santa Claus, and
because then you
find that unedifying, and it's not. It doesn't illuminate the darkness. It just makes people be like, I can't see the light.
Yeah, it's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, really, isn't it? It's like there's a lot of good in this, and like we were talking about the Christmas tree, that there's all these different images in the Christmas tree, and usually there's something about a Christmas tree is you don't usually put a Christmas tree up on your own. Like, I don't know what that is, but there's something about like this family event where you all kind of, it's parents and children, you all participate in it, and ultimately, I think, again, that's part of the Christmas tree's symbolism. It's like a family, it's a family project, and
but everyone gathering around the star, like
joining
the Magi and the shepherds, and it's all that same imagery.
Yeah, it's almost your part of the tree which unifies under that star. It's like you become joined up with the purpose of it. It's quite a because of that, you don't want to get rid of. You can't just throw these things away. But
I think one of the things that we do lose with, one of the many things that we lose with this kind of secular Christmas is the darkness itself. Like, that's the other argument that I hear critical Christians say, let's say. You actually lose the fact that it's dark.
Yeah.
Because of all the electric lights, because of Saint Nick, because of the folk stuff, the elves and the making toys in the North Pole, and like you lose the fact, and that's, for me, that's actually one of the beautiful things, that we recognize it's dark. We recognize, like you talked about earlier, how in a way it's not until you reach rock bottom that there is room then for Christ to come in. And it's so hard for people to see that they are rock bottom. There's something within our culture, kind of post-Enlightenment culture, which is about kind of changing the external till it fits what we want to see. And in a way, the excesses of the kind of Christmas culture does that. Like, it puts, you drive past that person's house and they've got like lights everywhere, and it's so garish.
Yeah.
And it's just, it seems to be a kind of a very modern move to just never stop.
Just banish the darkness completely.
Yeah, just to banish the darkness completely. And so, externally, it's like, whether it's putting up lights everywhere, turning the heating on, making life extremely comfortable, which, is obviously good. Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't, heat our homes, but there's something in this ancient liturgical pattern that the church gives us where actually we recognize where we are. And the idea being in Advent is you recognize it's dark outside, maybe it's dark inside. Maybe
Yeah.
it's dark for you, and you actually
Yeah.
recognize that, and then you beckon Christ to come
Yeah.
and save us. And so there's something in the kind of modern Christmas that really misses that.
Yeah, and I think in a way you've got this Christ comes at a point where it's almost hopeless. Like you're almost at a point of hopelessness. The days are getting shorter and shorter, and you're like, this is never going to stop. Eventually, it's just going to be one big night, and the sun's never going to rise again.
Yeah.
And then you hit this point, and it's then. I think that's why it's important that Advent kind of means coming, because it's like without that, you're at risk of like falling into total despair, and it's getting all evidence points towards, if you was to track day by day, all evidence is saying the sun's going away, and the warmth's going away, and the leaves have all died, everything's dying around you, and you're in this like really, like you said, very cold, very dark, very difficult time of the year.
I'm completely with you. I do feel like for modern people, it's all of a sudden, the last 100 years, very hard to actually live in that space, because when you talk about it kind of being hopeless and the sun's going away, again, I mean, we're in this beautiful church, we've got the candles there, but we also have loads of lights on. It is almost so easy to just miss all of that, what our ancient ancestors saw, just to completely miss reality.
Yeah.
Like, it is dark, it is cold, you need to light the fire, like, we haven't got much food, like,
everything's wet.
Everything's wet, everything's really hard. And I think, like, cultural memory and telling stories and things is a way to kind of at least tap into that. You know, like the St. Nicholas legend, and like the girls without dowries, and there's a danger in completely kind of paving over and plastering over and cushioning over reality.
Yes.
Because internally we're finding that with the meaning crisis, that now, the mental health crisis, like, we still suffer. Just because we're not cold, just because we've got our bellies are full, doesn't mean we don't suffer. We're just discovering actually we're suffering in a different way. We're discovering suffering through a lack of meaning. And so, I hear people that say, oh, these guys, you're just like nostalgic for another age, but you should embrace technology and all of that. But I think it's worth just saying, like, things aren't going great for people in terms of like their actual well-being and stuff, and a lot of that is wrought by modernity, the pace of life, again, the lack of meaning. So I think there's something to be said for looking into the what Advent and what the liturgical seasons try to give us in rooting our experience, in church, at home with our families, with nature in a really holistic way.
Yeah. I think what you're basically saying is that we in order to solve our problems, we turn towards the material world for the answers, and that is most modern people, and I think most people in general, probably think the material world is where we'll find the answers to our problems, and it's by increasing our technological capability and subsequently our power to be able to have influence over the world, that's how we'll earn our salvation. Ultimately, I think that's that's what it is.
They don't use that term, but that is exactly what they mean.
I think that's what they're doing. But I think what Jesus is saying is almost, I don't quite think it's the opposite, but he's kind of saying, I don't think he's just saying, he's not claiming that the solution is 100% spiritual, but I think what he's saying is that it's through him. It's through
the union of spirit.
Yeah, that's why he's coming down to earth. It's not that we're just looking up to him and he's just this thing in the sky. He's coming down to earth so we can see the bringing together of the. It's like, I mean, as a carpenter, he's doing forms of technology and building things which they're not bad in themselves, but it's the spiritual component that's missing from the modern world. I think
again, it's like as plain as the sort of nose on your face that is what Christmas is, that is what Christ is, and that is what the answer is. And again, people will be like, who do you think you are? You've got the answers. It's like the material world is good, spirit is good, like your own well-being. Even if you don't believe in God, like people say like, oh yeah, my spirits are low. Like, maybe not young people, but like my grandparents used to say that, oh, my spirits are low.
We just have good synonyms for that now, like depressed or
anxious. But it's like, and obviously the answer then is therefore is not to repudiate the material, but it is just to open up like a place to be spiritually well, which again is this Christian image, this Christmas image of the union of spirit and matter.
Yeah, and it's
hope.
in that darkness that it happens. So it's the image is there. It basically is. This is why it kind of can. You kind of feel like you're going a bit mad, I suppose, when you're thinking about this, because you're like, it can't be this simple.
Yeah, it's like so simple, and it's like, yeah, and it's like a truth. It's like a one-size-fits-all answer. Of course, it's extremely. Yeah. I'm gonna say it's extremely complex.
I imagine. I think it's simple.
Complex.
It's simple and deep. Maybe it's like it's got depth to it.
It's got depth, yeah. It's got depth.
On the face of it, it's actually, it's basically a star surrounded by darkness, and it's like, that's. So there you go. It's the light and the dark. You know. Yeah. It's something. It's actually quite a simple image, and I think
This is what's so hard to speak to, like trying to speak to friends and things, and not to be a really annoying like Christian, but to at least try and speak to people, because it's like, I find in my conversations that I'm like, maybe having a beer with someone and you're like, in your head you're thinking, the answer to that is probably Christ. And then you think again, and they say something else and you're like, I think the answer to that's Christ. And it's really hard, because when you become a Christian, like the answer to everything is basically Christ.
Yeah.
And it's like, we know there's a lot of depth to that. But the beauty of what he brings us is the simplest person, and I'm no genius, but the simplest person can comprehend it. And that's the beauty of the gift that he gives. But it's like, the answer is just, go to church and,
Like you said, when you're in the cultural Christian kind of, in that kind of, let's say you're swimming in that water.
Yeah.
All the wisdom of Christ actually just sounds like frivolous platitudes to people.
Exactly.
And so they can't hear it.
Yeah.
And that's why when you say to someone that, that Jesus is the light coming into the darkness of the world, to kind of offer hope and redemption, that sounds like something that you've read off the back of a prayer card or something like that. Yeah. And because of that, people that have heard that before, it didn't make any sense to me.
It's so hard, because it's like, every little node, like Christmas trees or holly wreaths or candles in the dark, or obviously candles are universal, but the way that we're using them, it's like, all those little nodes, they all point back to Christ. Yeah. But it's like, it's just one move, but it's like, it's so hard. People are kind of inoculated to that.
Yeah.
There is this interesting thing happening, which is this kind of image of the Krampus.
Yes.
So this slightly demonic.
Yeah. So I became aware in the last few years of like the Whitby Krampus run that seems to happen. I see the pictures of it and it looks quite interesting.
Yeah. I think I'll be honest, I'm going to be like the reactionary here. I think it looks completely satanic.
It does. Yeah. Well, when I say interesting, I was trying to give the benefit of the doubt, but it definitely looks striking and strange. Yeah. And it's definitely monstrous looking. Yeah. So.
Sorry, just throwing in my reaction.
No, that's absolutely fine. I actually was just trying to take a softer, but that is the way it appears. And so I thought I'd try and learn a little bit more about Krampus and where it comes from, what it actually is, what it means. And I found some interesting things actually. So often Krampus it comes from like these alpine nations or regions of like Europe. So a lot of places like Germany and Austria. And so you've got this, essentially what he is a horned monster animal thing. So it's basically a beast, essentially. He's basically it's a pagan image, I think. It's a really old image, comes from a really long time ago. But what the people would use Krampus as was almost like, remember we talked about the gargoyles when we were talking about in our Halloween discussion, and about them being apotropaic. Essentially, they would be a monster that scares away dark spirits. Yeah. So it actually would, in a way, it's a monster, but its purpose was to protect the people. It was to be a monster to the monsters that were unknown.
So it doesn't, but then there's the thing about kidnapping children.
Yes, so here's the flip side of it.
Okay.
So that's like the pagan origin sort of side to it. It started to be integrated with the St. Nicholas story. And so you would have St. Nicholas going around sort of rewarding kids for being good by offering them a gift. Yep. If kids are not being good, you had like this Krampus. So he's like an anti-Santa. Okay. So he basically is the opposite side of reward, like good behavior equals reward. You've got bad behavior equals like essentially like attack. Or it's like this fear. There's quite a strong fear element, which is quite disturbing to see from someone who's not grown up with that as part of our tradition. I don't quite like the idea of scaring kids into into behaving. But
Yeah.
that's kind of the tradition it sort of plays, especially in Europe. And a lot of people will still use that as someone will dress up as Krampus, someone will dress up as Saint Nick, and they'll go around as like a strange odd couple.
I think there's something in that. Again, we've always got this tension, haven't we, in the faith with like a dualism.
Yeah.
But you can see symbolically, on a symbolic level, again, I'm also not for like scaring kids into being good. Rather, the reward of being good, like the idea of being good should be, enough. But again, it's this kind of image of hell.
Yeah.
Not in a sort of eschatological way, but the kind of hell you could be living in now if you don't do the right thing.
Yes.
And there's a kind of idea that it's just, that's kind of the way that reality works.
Yeah.
Like if you don't do right, you could be in a monstrous place.
Yeah. Sorry, I've just had a thought. This
Yeah.
just popped in my head, so I've got to say it. It just reminded me of, I recently heard, I was watching a Jordan Peterson video, he was just talking about how Peter, when Christ basically tells Peter that he's going to be the rock and found the church, and then he tells him to get behind him, and it calls him Satan.
Yeah.
And the reason Jordan Peterson's interpretation of this, and I don't know what people would think of this, but his idea was that there is a place for Satan which is behind you, because you not only need something good to move towards, but you need something bad to move away from. And Krampus kind of plays that role, is like, it's almost like this, the role of the evil is to be pushing you forward but from behind.
Yes.
If you see what I'm saying.
Yeah,
that
so makes sense.
It's like you want to move towards the light, but you also want to know that the darkness is behind you, and you want to move away from that. So you kind of, it's got this push and pull sort of imagery to it.
I can see that.
And so perhaps that's where it fits in. It's almost like the idea that Satan has a place, but it's behind you, and it's.
I think like a lot of these folklore elements, like we talked about with Halloween, I can see the purpose that they serve. It's just we may feel uncomfortable with how far to go with them.
Yes.
For me, it feels like an unnecessary addition to our culture. However, what we're interested in doing here, and what we're kind of interested in doing at Disciples of Divine Logos, and with these videos and our meaning thing, is actually looking at what is happening, what is going on, and trying to find out what the deeper significance of that is. Like why, as far as I know, it's been in some movies recently-ish.
Yes, I think there was
in this decade
film,
at least.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of been brought to the awareness of people in Britain. And so the question is, why are people drawn towards it? They're not Christian. Why are they drawn towards it? Why? So Whitby, which is not far from where we both live, that's got associations with Dracula, with St. Hilda turning the snakes to stone, which we often talk about. It's got a kind of element of darkness to its local context, like to its story. So they've started doing Krampus runs there, and you see people dressed as Krampus. It's a huge thing, and they really go to town with the costumes.
Yeah.
The question is, all of this to say, why?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is something like,
because I think the people that are, and I'm not trying to condemn people actually, and I'm really not. I'm kind of joking when I'm saying it's. Well, I'm half joking when I say it's satanic, because I don't think we often don't realize what we're doing.
Yes.
Why we're doing what we're
that's a good
doing.
way of putting it.
And I don't think people realize why they're dressing up, why they're trying to, manifest, become a demonic figure, because they all dress up as kind of demonic figures, basically.
Yeah.
And people can say, well, I'm not a Christian, so I don't recognize it's a demon, it's a monster, but let's be honest, we live in a Christian milieu, and it looks like a demon, a devil, I don't think they realize why they're doing it. It's a subconscious thing. Maybe they, like we talked about, recognizing the darkness that you might live in, like including Christians as well, like including me, not being holier than thou at all, recognizing the darkness that you're in, and that you need something to lift you out of that. You can't kind of do it by your own steam. And I wonder if, people feel like they don't fit, because it's a kind of strange subculture. It's like, I don't fit, and if they do feel like that, that's totally understandable, because our culture's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Like, what does it mean to fit? Like, to be,
Yeah, do you really
wealthy,
want to fit?
or like, do you want to, like, what does it mean? Yeah, what do you have to sell? what is it, profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul. It seems like you often have to sell your soul to kind of fit into our kind of slightly shallow culture.
Yeah, there might be something of the rebellious in that desire to take up a Krampus costume and march through the street. But I think when you look at it from the emergent, I was talking to my wife Katie about this the other day actually. Regardless of the mechanical reasons and the actual reasons for why people do it, when you start to notice that hordes of monsters are walking through what was a nice seaside town up till 10 years ago. I mean, I'm saying it's still a nice seaside town, but they didn't walk around there yet. I'm not saying it's gone. If you was to walk through the street and you see just these monsters everywhere, monsters are in the streets regardless of the reasons why. It's unlike just an observational image, you're at a point where there's parades of monsters through the streets, and the question, like you said, is like, what does this mean? Like, there must be a meaning behind it.
And we're not. I'm sorry to be the boring kind of person that has to just. We're not saying that these people are literally monsters.
No, of course not.
But we're saying that when they dress up, that is what they're attempting to participate in.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the question is like, what does that mean? Why is it happening? Why do people want to dress up, and to parade through the street dressed as monsters? It's funny as well because you often see. I saw some photos. In fact, I saw a little video of one of the parades the other day as I was looking into the Krampus thing, and there was a guy dressed up as like a bishop, like a Turkish bishop in the. So there's almost like a Saint Nicholas character there as well, which I thought was fascinating because he was almost leading the parade, and I was like, he was outnumbered. There's a lot more Krampuses than there were Saint Nick's, but.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because in a way that they're actually thinking about this. They're thinking about stories. They think about legend and folklore, and so they've discovered. And I know the St. Nicholas character is part of it. Like we said, a lot more on the continent. St. Nicholas is more prominent anyway. But there is a way there where that could even point back to,
I did actually think, I wonder if that guy, whether he's just doing it because it's part of the character and part of the story and he'd like to dress up like that, or whether he's somebody who's like, the way to get these guys is to join them, but be the good part of the dark, like be the light of the dark.
Maybe we should all do that.
Yeah, just a counter.
An army of St. Nicholas's to send on Whitby.
Counter parade. They just walk in the other direction.
But that's really. That definitely made the news. 50 St. Nicholas's all coming out. Bishop's hats. That's interesting. Do you know? I want to say something. I think. Because I always find it hard to talk about. So I've been in that town when the Krampus thing happens, and I've seen it. Like I didn't go for that. I was just there, and I saw people dressed up, and actually on an evening, and it was right outside a church. Actually, there are a lot of churches in Whitby, so they didn't specifically pick to do it outside of a church, but right in the centre of the harbour, there's two churches. There's an Anglican church and a Catholic church, and they weren't picking on the church, but they were outside with like fire. Like drumming and like kind of throwing up fire and everything like in a circle, and it was all happening at night and things. And I actually popped in to see the priest the next day. I bumped into him, I should say, in the Catholic church. It's always open, and it's a Church of St. Hilda. But I just want to say, I always feel difficult talking about it because it feels like you're being a killjoy, and you're being a kind of reactionary Christian fundamentalist type person, which is not what I'm trying to say at all. And there is a sense of, I feel, within the whole kind of goth, they also have a big goth festival there, where growing up in our culture, you meet lots of people, maybe you met these people at school who don't quite fit in, but actually you know that when you stop to speak to those kids when you were a child at the time, teenager at the time, they're often the most interesting. They're often the most interesting. They're often doing a lot more thinking than the rest of us. It's just they're a bit awkward, and they're looking for something to participate in, something that will accept them. And again, I just think about kind of Christ going into this marginal space, going into the darkness, and redeeming it. And I don't know, I'm just adding a thought that maybe there's some sort of strange hope in people looking for things, and these people potentially having a lot of potential. Yeah.
I think that is really, again, Christmas is the image of this. It's the image of the darkness and then the light emerging out of the darkness. And so, I mean, the Christmas period is this it's essentially the night of the year. So it's like the midnight of the year. It's this point of like, this point where it's really dark, but it plays that role for the entire cycle of the year.
Yeah.
There's something about the darkness and it needing, the darkness being a requirement for this rebirth and this kind of like, I mean, that's essentially what happens at the crucifixion and the resurrection. It's essentially this like descent into darkness and then the rebirth. It wasn't just that Christ immediately, I mean, he could have just ascended to heaven and cut out the crucifixion altogether, and it wouldn't have worked at all because it needs this descent into the total darkness, ultimate evil, and then you have this, and again, it's kind of like this idea of the light not being able to be overcome by the darkness.
Yeah, I wonder in a way, in a strange way, it might be, let's say, in God's kind of good judgment, part of how these things have to play out.
Yeah.
Because the darkness is there and you can't see, we talked about this before, but you can't see the light if there isn't a bit of darkness around.
Yeah, yeah.
And something about trying to stamp that out in the way that some kind of more reactionary fundamentalist folks would do.
Maybe that's the equivalent of putting on the central heating and covering your house in Christmas lights. Trying to stamp out to be like, it's not dark.
Yeah.
We don't need the darkness. But I think you're right, and there's something interesting about the darkness. The darker it gets, the brighter the light gets. Mm-hmm. And there's a connection between those two things that it has to get so dark before the light becomes, it becomes bright, visible, and then super bright. And I just think it's really interesting to think of what's happening in the culture as this like darkening. Yeah. And as it gets darker and darker, these lights will start to glow brighter and brighter. Yeah. And that's, I think that's what Santa Claus and Saint Nicholas is even within the consumerism of Christmas, this because of what's happening in that respect, and like with the Krampus thing kind of being introduced to our idea of Christmas for the first time, really in the last few years, where it started to become a thing that people have even known about. Like I'd heard about it before, we discussed it today, and it's only because it's becoming a little more in the background. And Christmas is always kind of evolving new traditions as well, like the whole elf on the shelf thing, which is quite new, and that's suddenly just become a staple of almost every child in the country.
So I'd never heard of elf because my kids are too little. I hadn't heard of elf on the shelf until last week, and I'm told it's been around for like 5 years.
Yeah, I think it's been around for, I think it's almost 10 years.
Oh wow!
And I think it's a bit of a social media phenomenon, really. So I think what happened is, it's the first Christmas tradition, I think, that has been spurred on by social media.
Right.
So for anyone who doesn't know what Elf on the Shelf is, not that I'm particularly an expert on it, because I've always refused to do it because it always seemed a bit creepy to me. But basically what it is you have these little toy elves that you can buy from almost anywhere. They're very cheap, don't cost anything. And you put it, in theory, on a shelf, but you put it somewhere in your house. Okay. And on the build up to Christmas, usually over like the Advent period, once you get your decorations out, you have this elf, and it essentially, each morning you'll put the elf in a new position, or kind of maybe move objects around the house, or people set up all these like elaborate scenarios. Some of them get really disturbing, and it's quite a dark. There's a dark side to this elf on the shelf thing, but basically they'll play a prank where maybe the kid will wake up, a child will wake up, and in your bedroom, the elf stood in the corner and your toys are all over the place. That's a really innocent example of it.
Okay, so they kind of get up to mischief.
It's like the elf has been mischievous around the house.
Okay, yeah.
And it's done as like you wake up and what has the elf done today kind of thing.
So the parents are part of this and they...
Yes. Yeah, okay. Now, the weird side of it, that's got a weird element because there's like a trickster element to it. Yeah, so for me, a Christmas elf is something that creates toys, it makes toys. Yeah. It's a helper of Santa. Yeah. This elf is akin to like Santa's spy. So the point of it is that he will watch you, and that's how Santa will know whether you've been good or bad. The fundamental elements of the elf on the shelf is you have this trickster that plays pranks, and the point of the playing pranks on children and moving it around during the night and that kind of thing is to convince the child that this thing is actually alive. And then that leads on to its other purpose, which is to monitor behavior. Okay. So a child then feels a lot more like if they've got an elf in their bedroom, then they're being watched. But there is an element of Santa, which is this judgment. And I was thinking about...
He knows if you've been naughty, he knows if you've been nice.
Yeah, so I was thinking about how how do you reconcile this idea that Santa can judge?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about this, it popped up as I was like going through, I don't like Elf on the Shelf because there's this, who's he to say what's good and bad? I know I'm getting right into like a morality debate with an elf on a shelf, but then I was thinking but that is what Santa does as well. He does that, and I don't see that as being necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah, so I think, and again, that's where the Christian criticism of the Santa Claus folklore is, where he takes on the qualities of God.
Yes.
You know, and even for a traditional Christian that really pays heed, as we do, to the communion of saints, like, you wouldn't necessarily think Saint Nicholas is like the criterion of good and evil.
Yeah.
Like, he can pray for us, but it's taking a step up, which we're not actually super comfortable with.
Yeah, and it's almost like a microcosm of judgment, I suppose, for a child, because there's this like reward or punishment, which is traditionally would be, I mean, since we don't have Krampus, it would be a present or coal.
Or a lump of coal, yeah.
Yeah, which is like the classic example. And then up from that, it's almost like an image of this like almost like your soul being weighed kind of thing, and this like judgment. And I just wondered whether maybe it was just a microcosm of that in a child's mind, so they kind of get into a relationship with that idea of like making sure. But you're right, there's something a bit strange about the omnipresence of Santa Claus, and by extension his elves. Yeah, like it couldn't just be that Santa Claus knows it. Now it's like, well, he actually needs a physical object.
So I didn't realise. I thought the Elf on the Shelf thing was, I don't know, because the example that I'd heard was someone whose kids were a bit older, and it's like they knew.
Yeah.
And I could see it, if it was kind of introduced then, I could see it being just kind of a bit fun.
Bit fun, okay.
You know? And I guess, and there is precedence in, you know, European folklore of kind of fairies, elves being mischievous.
Yes.
And having a darker side to them as well. Again, it sounds like an easy answer now that I'm going to throw out. But I wonder if the solution is just to have, so it's complex. It's a complex image, post-Christian, secularism, Christian tradition, all this kind of stuff jumbled in around Advent and Christmas. Complex thing. And I wonder if the solution is just to have faith.
Yeah.
Like, I wonder if the solution is just to have faith in these things. You know, one has to decide what they engage with, like, through your own conscience. But I wonder if it's just to have faith. Like you say, if these things didn't communicate something good, they wouldn't stick. Yeah. Like, if they weren't edifying, uplifting, if they didn't speak into some kind of truth, they wouldn't stick. And I think of Tolkien, I think of J.R. Tolkien, who's, you know, been on pretty much everyone's lips for the last few years, that's kind of interested in this meaning crisis space. And he didn't have a problem with like fairy stories. I mean, he even wrote an essay on fairy stories, and he had absolutely no issue with that whatsoever. And so I wonder if there's something for Christians, for followers of Christ, where the best thing to do is just have faith that, you know, these things will ultimately be filled with the incarnation. Yeah. I don't know, that sounds too easy to say, but...
Now, I think there's something right about that, though. And so when we recently did one of our meetings, I think it was Daniel who brought up a quote, and I don't remember who he said it, but essentially the gist of it was something like, don't resist evil and turn to the light. And I think that really nicely sort of sums up what you were just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is something to that about just having faith, focusing on God, and just essentially trying to let His will be done, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that's probably as best an end point for this video that we're going to get. I mean, that is literally where we are. We're just over 2 weeks away. Is that right? From Christmas?
Yeah.
Yes, just over 2 weeks away from Christmas Day, waiting for the arrival of Christ. So we hope you've enjoyed this video. We just want to wish everybody, I think, a wonderful Christmas.
Yeah, Merry Christmas, everyone.
May it be hopeful, joyful, and most of all, peaceful as we celebrate the arrival of Jesus Christ.
God bless.
Thanks.
Now the holy Bezaberry has blood, it is red. Then trust we our Saviour who rose from the dead. and Mary bore Jesus Christ our Saviour for to be, and the first tree in the greenwood it was the holly, holly.